This is my fifth video on my attempts to construct a small OO gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this, and my lengthy series on my N-gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains running, etc. This part is basically just a progress report. Still a long way to go on this layout. I guess the main feature this week has been building the first station for the layout from an old Airfix Booking Hall plastic kit and a Metcalfe Stone platform card kit. There will also be running videos showing me trying to figure out how to actually operate this layout. This is the Airfix Booking Hall kit after I first opened its box. It appeared to be complete despite being perhaps as much as 50 years old. However, much to my frustration, I somehow managed to lose one of the smallest dormer window parts, as seen at top left in the box here, in the process of carrying the parts around and painting them. Here are the outer walls and chimneys getting sprayed in something close to a brick red. Sorry, my camera really hates to focus on this kind of thing. And here the windows, etc. get painted off-white on one side. And the roof gets sprayed slate grey. And the canopy and the chimney tops get sprayed buff. I finally got around to fixing down the miscellaneous controls for the layout, albeit not very tidily. I cut a piece of chipboard from an old piece of shelving that I had around and painted it vaguely white. The Atlas selector and connector with the green and yellow switches were screwed down with the little screws that came with them. The Bachmann EasyTrack points had holes in them, presumably to allow them to be fixed down, but they were too tiny for any screws that I had, so I ended up using little nails, and those were tricky to put in without damaging the fairly fragile switches. I used tweezers to put a nail into position, and then a small tack hammer and a punch to drive the nail down once it had been started, so as not to risk hitting the switch itself with a hammer. The result isn't at all pretty, but it does mean that all the controls are kept firmly in position, which makes it easier to operate them. I suppose it would be much neater if I drilled holes through and passed all the wires through more out of the way. As it is, my control area works, but it's still quite messy. I had a couple of short straight track sections left over from my previous modification, moving the goods shed over onto a spur at the back left. See the previous part, part 4 of this series. So I figured I might as well use those in the original yard area, where I was now planning to put a terminal station. Since I wanted to make the station platform as long as possible, model railway platforms are almost always too small, I would have preferred to use both extra straights by the platform, but there really wasn't room, so I decided to just add one to each line. I fitted them temporarily to measure things out. Since these tracks were recessed into a raised yard area, I needed to extend the cutout area for each track to accommodate the extra length. This was done by just cutting through the foam board raised area with a sharp knife. There were wires underneath these tracks for feeding power to the two branches. Here I've moved the original track over to one side and pried out the piece cut out for the extended area. And here's the same thing for the other branch. Whilst I had the tracks out, I painted round them with grey paint so that the white edges of the foam board wouldn't show. I also painted the front edges of the board itself and the edges of the hills on the front of the board brown, as it seemed that would be better than having those edges just showing as white foam. Eventually I got back to assembling the Airfix Booking Hall kit. I stuck the pieces for the chimneys together, and then fitted them into the recesses on the roof. Then I did some washes to improve the look of things, a thin brown wash for the brickwork and a black wash for the roof and chimneys. I also painted the tops of the chimney pots black. When I went to glue the windows into the walls, I realized that they went in the opposite way to how I'd originally thought, so I needed to paint the other sides of them. Probably best to have both sides painted anyway. Here are the branch lines back down after their extension, The terminal station is intended to go on that top branch track. I taped together a couple of legal-sized pieces of paper and made a template of the area where the station platform and building were to go. Meanwhile, I went back to assembling the Airfix kit, gluing the windows into the walls and painting the base areas of the walls black. I had painted the windows on both sides, and as we all know, styrene cement will not stick parts together if they're painted, since it's a solvent which works by dissolving the plastic itself. So I had to file or scrape off the paint from the surfaces that were to be glued. Here are the 4 walls of the building with all of their windows and doors in place. And here are the 4 walls glued together, a bit tricky to do, and unfortunately the long walls have warped a bit. This is the platform side. Above the right-hand door you can see where the transom window that I lost should have gone. Losing it really bugged me, but I just couldn't find it. Its loss shouldn't be too obvious, as the canopy will rather hide that area. This is the end of the building, with a screen for the toilet door. I gave up on the poly cement and resorted to CA super glue to attach the brackets for the canopy, as they were so small and fiddly, and it would have been really hard to get the paint off to make them stick with poly cement. I applied a black wash to the canopy itself to weather it like the other parts. Now the roof is in place and the building is almost complete. The kit did provide printed pieces for the clock and the posters, but these were just printed paper, not decals, so the clock especially was hard to cut out neatly. The posters were rather rudimentary, somewhat crudely printed in only 2 colours. But I didn't have anything better on hand in 00 gauge, so I figured I might as well use them. Because the long walls were warped, I tried to straighten them out somewhat by bracing with pieces of sprue cut to length. I'm honestly not sure if this really improved matters. Still, the building doesn't look too bad, and will probably make a reasonable appearance on the layout. A bit of a random digression here. I picked up an old Hornby R055 model of a Fowler 4P tank loco locally from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario. But someone had fitted it with caddy couplings, which I have no intention of using in 00 gauge. Here's the caddy coupling on the other end, the back of the loco. Nigel of British Model Trains gave me a couple of hook and loop couplings when I bought the loco, since I really have no stock of 00 gauge spares currently. The front caddy coupling was just bolted onto the top of the bracket where the original coupling had been. I removed it by simply undoing the bolt, and I was able to use the same bolt to attach one of the replacement couplings, though I did have to enlarge the holes in that coupling for the retaining pins at either end quite a bit. This did result in the bolt protruding from the bottom a bit. It can't be seen, but I may have to remove the end part of the bolt if it ends up fouling anything. The rear coupling was a bit different, similar, but the retaining pins were much smaller. And when I bolted on the rear coupling, it sat so far forward that it rubbed on the rear wheels of the bogie, preventing them from turning. I was able to get around that problem by just filing grooves for the flanges of the wheels into the plastic of the coupling. The result seemed to work reasonably well for coupling and drawing wagons. The only problem was that the new couplings had rather narrow loops, so sometimes the hooks of other rolling stock didn't catch those loops, especially if you tried to couple on anything other than a straight, which is always a bit iffy. But generally the engine seemed to work well. Nigel did say that he'd serviced it. Another issue with this loco is that its rear end swings very wide as it goes round tight curves. This is just a consequence of the basic design of the loco, with a large rear bogie behind 6 driving wheels. As you may see here, the back of the loco barely clears my hill as it goes round this curve. I suppose perhaps I shouldn't have formed that hill so close to the track, but nothing has actually hit it yet, so I'm going to leave it as it is for now. For the platform of the terminal station, I used a Metcalfe 00 gauge stone platform kit. The first step was to cut the top of the platform from the Metcalfe asphalt sheets. I decided to have a ramp at one end, but to have a wall at the other end of the platform. The rectangle protruding is to fit around the Airfix building. Next, as per the instructions, I glued thin card strips along the railside edge of the platform, leaving a gap where the ramp needed to bend. I cut out and formed some of the various supporting pieces provided with the kit. I separated out the pieces for the railside edge and for the walls, mostly straight pieces, but with provision for one ramp. I glued together the printed edging pieces and the heavy backing card pieces to make a continuous reinforced edge for the rail side of the platform. Then I glued this in place up against the thin edging pieces and held it vertical by various reinforcing pieces. This provided the basic form of the platform with its railside edge. I've built several platforms from Metcalfe kits before, so this was the easy part, but what I've never done before is used the Metcalfe kit provisions for platform walls. For the back edges of the platform, which were to have walls, I didn't exactly follow the procedure suggested in the kit instructions. Instead, I made up pieces with the reinforcing backing glued to the printed front parts, and then I glued the thin capstone strips to the top of these pieces before attaching them to the platform. It seemed to me that this made getting the assembly correct easier. The instructions said to glue the edging pieces to the platform first, aligning them as closely as possible to the platform edges, then to trim the platform edges down to the vertical pieces with a sharp knife, and then to glue on the thin capstone strips. But that just seemed to me making things unnecessarily difficult, so I did it the other way round. Here you can see the same piece from the top with the thin capstone strip protruding above the platform, ready to support the wall. Definitely seems to me it's easier if you glue that capstone strip to the backing first and then glue it onto the platform. This is the other end, the end without the ramp. Again, the back edge has been made up with facing, reinforcing card and the capstone strip lapping over the top, and then glued to the platform itself and braced to keep it vertical. And here's that piece from the top. Of course, those two long end pieces were the easiest. Since I wanted walls around the platform extension for the building and on the end of the platform, I also had to make the edges for those shorter sections with wall supports. Here's the whole thing from the bottom, with the bottom edging all done, but the walls not yet on. Next, I made up walls from two facing sections, sandwiching two heavy card pieces between the printed sections. And I glued these up against the supporting edges that came from the previous pieces. Then I put capstones onto the top of all these walls, considerably improving their appearance. At the corners, I had just glued the square end of one piece flat against the end of the other piece. I suppose it would have made neater corners if I'd beveled the ends where they met. I cut extra pieces of wall facing and scored them and bent them and then glued them round the corners to hide the exposed ends of the wall pieces. Here's the finished platform with the Airfix building in place. The self-adhesive strips for the edging of the platform do appear nice. Unfortunately, I find that no matter how well you burnish them, they have a tendency to come unstuck over time. You can see here fairly clearly how I did the corners of the walls. Not great, I guess, but I think I can live with it. Here's the back of the building. This bit was quite awkward to do, as it had to fit right into the gap in the walls, and the capstone strip had to be cut away where the building was. Since there obviously had to be some way of getting at the back doors of the building, I made some steps for them from pieces of card. And then I painted those steps grey. And here is the station on that spur on the layout. A bit odd, I suppose, but I think I can live with it. I did do some work with a soft pencil to darken the edges of the card pieces on the card platform, but it looks as if a bit more of that is needed here and there. You can also see the pieces of sprue I glued inside the building from the right angle with the right lighting. This is a flash photograph, but you wouldn't really see them just looking at the layout normally, I don't think. Here's the view from the ramp end of the platform. I'm not exactly thrilled with this, but it will do for now while I get other areas of the layout filled in. Here's the back of the station with the steps. Obviously this could be improved, but for now I'm going to move on to getting the other station in place, which will mean building another platform and also the Metcalfe, Settle and Carlisle small station building kit. Now I'm going to show some running video, but before I do I want to try and explain how this layout is supposed to operate so you can better understand what I'm doing or failing to do. The Bachmann EasyTrack points are remotely controlled, but they do not switch the electrical power to the tracks at all. Power flows over the points to all tracks at all times, regardless of how the points are set. This means that if I had one power connection and no isolating joins, every piece of track on the layout would be powered at all times. That would be perfectly fine for DCC, but for DC, simple DC operation, it would mean that when I turned up the throttle, every loco on the layout would move at once, regardless of whether it was on the main line or in a siding or in a shed. To be able to park locos in sidings, etc., and have them stay put whilst other locos move on other parts of the layout, I had to divide the layout into electrically isolated sections using isolated joiners between track sections, and then to power each of those isolated sections separately with its own power feed and make all of those power feeds switchable. This diagram shows how I did this. The blue lines indicate the isolated joins. The red X's indicate the power feeds. On this version of the diagram I have identified all of the power zones and all of the turnout points. The power zones are indicated from Z1 to Z6. Red lines show the extent of each zone, and the zones are divided from each other by the blue lines showing the isolated joins. The points are also marked from P1 to P5. Note that the 5 points are themselves powered from 2 power zones. P1, P2 and P3 are all powered from zone 6, the main line, and so will have no power if the main line power is switched off. P4 and P5 are powered from zone 3, the main siding, and so those points will only have power when the zone 3 power is turned on. This refers to the power for trains passing over the tracks, not power to operate the changing of the points. That comes from the AC accessory power and will always be present so long as the controller is turned on. Zone 6 is the main line and powers all of the main loop except for the passing siding section at the left end. As noted, this mainline zone also powers points P1, P2 and P3. Zone 1 is the outer branch of the passing siding and Zone 2 is the inner branch of the passing siding, so trains can be parked on either of these branches by turning Zone 1 or Zone 2 off. Zone 3 is the main siding, going down from P3 to the terminal station. Zone 4 is the branch to the engine shed, going from P4 into the engine shed. Zone 5 is the branch going to the cargo shed, going from P5 into the shed. The power switches and point control switches in the control area are arranged from left to right in order by the zone and point numbering, Z1 to Z6, P1 to P5. Power switches are on when up and off when down. Point switches are pass when left, divert when right. I stress again, power control and point control are completely independent. Switching the power does not affect the points, and changing the points does not affect the power. Speed and direction of loco movement are, of course, controlled by the main power controller. Forward direction is always clockwise, reverse anti-clockwise. So the terminal station and engine shed, zones 3 and 4, are entered forwards and left backwards. Conversely, the cargo shed in Zone 5 is entered backward and left forward. If all of that makes sense to you, you should be able to understand what's going on in the following running video. Although, as you will see, I haven't really got it all straight myself, and I still keep making mistakes while trying to operate this layout, relatively simple though it is. My N-gauge layout, although much more complex as a track plan, is actually much simpler to operate as it uses Kato Unitrack, where the points themselves switch the electric power to the tracks, so there's no need for isolated zones and switchable power feeds. Anyway, now to the running video, such as it is. I'm going to see if I can demonstrate a little procedures with the new station. Some slightly complex procedures if I get it right. Okay, so we've got a passenger train sitting here on the outer line where the other station is intended to be, but we haven't built the other station yet. So if we draw that passenger train round, there's your passenger train with the 4P and 3 LMS coaches going on the main line, and we'll keep it going on the main line for now, I think, hopefully, yes. So now supposing we want to pull those coaches into our little terminal station, but we don't want to pull that engine in first, because that would create problems. So we stop the train on the passing loop and we see if we can uncouple the engine from the train, which is, what's uncoupling this stuff is always, I don't have any proper uncoupling tracks, so the uncoupling itself is kind of hard to do. Okay. And then what shall we do? We'll maybe bring the Ginty out from his shed there in the new station. Whoops. This layout is not easy to operate, it must be said. There's the Ginty. Direction. Now I'm going to try and move, and he's got stuck on the point. No, he should be going, he's just not going because he's stuck on the point. All of the things do tend to get stuck. The point's set in the right direction, but these things just tend to get stuck on the points if you don't. Oh, maybe I don't have the right power turned on there. Oh, you're running across a bit of the main line there, isn't he? And I don't have the main line power turned on. that's sort of what we wanted to do, kind of. So let's stop the Ginty a bit there. Put him down there, I suppose. We can. That wasn't where I was planning to put him, I have to say. Where I was planning to put him was there, and I think we will put him there on the inner loop. Okay, so then we'll turn him off. And we're going to try and push the carriages into the station using the Ginty, we hope. Because I can't see the end of the station. Well, I don't think we can go much further than that, can we, really? So you can't really fit those in there entirely, but what the heck. That's as far as they'll go, I think. Yes, now they're touching the bumper. Okay, so there you go. So our passengers, we hope, do their thing, they get on and off the station, and then we pull the train back out again. And we attempt once more to uncouple it. Carriages are just drifting there. Up and make sure it's coupled back to the train. Which it doesn't do too easily because it's got rather a narrow coupling on it. Okay. And then off we go again. Oh, well, you know what, before we do that, no, let's not do that immediately. Let's not do that immediately. We could do that, but let's not do that immediately. Let's put the Ginty away first. Let's put the Ginty away first. Okay. And now, famous last words, This layout is complicated to operate. And there you go, our passenger train can now go merrily on its way on the main